The jungle shook with a deep thundering rhythm. Birds burst from the canopy in a frantic wave. Jake Carter froze, mid-step, his pulse hammering. Through the trees a shadow loomed vast and primal. Branches cracked like brittle bones under its weight. He caught a glimpse of jagged teeth and eyes like molten gold. The air tasted of earth and blood. A roar split the silence, shaking the ground beneath his boots. Every instinct screamed to run, yet his legs locked. Somewhere in that living wall of muscle and scale was a ruler of this land. The Dino King had arrived. Jake Carter had crossed many wild lands, but nothing prepared him for the hidden valley of Kilora. It lay far beyond known maps, deep inside a chain of mountains that locals feared to approach. Old tales spoke of creatures from the dawn of time still walking there. Most dismissed the stories as myths told by frightened villagers, yet Jake had seen enough strange things to keep his mind open. He was an explorer by trade and a seeker by heart, driven by a need to find the last untouched places on Earth. The valley opened before him, like a wound in the land. From the cliff edge he saw a vast green basin wrapped in mist. Rivers cut silver paths through thick forests. The air shimmered with heat, and distant calls echoed up from below. Some sounded like the cries of birds, yet far too deep and powerful to belong to anything with feathers alone. He had arrived alone after weeks of dangerous climbing and treks through swamps where every step could end in a sinkhole. His first camp was set near a wide waterfall. The spray cooled the air and masked the scent from the valley's unseen inhabitants, or so he hoped. He was cautious, for he knew that predators ruled wild lands without mercy. Nights in Kilora were alive with sounds. Shrill whistles, deep rumbling growls, the snapping of branches under heavy weight. Each noise painted a picture in his mind of creatures too massive to belong to this age. He kept his campfire small, knowing that bright flames might attract unwanted attention. 3 days passed before he saw his first dinosaur. It was a herd of long-necked giants moving across the plain. Their hides were patterned in earthy shades that blended with the grasslands. He watched in awe as they grazed, tearing whole branches from trees with a casual swing of their necks. They moved with a slow grace that belied their size. He sketched them quickly in his worn notebook, noting details of scale texture and the way their tails swayed for balance. If these creatures existed here, perhaps the rest of the legends were true. In the market towns beyond the mountains, Jake had heard whispers of one beast above all others, a predator without rival. They called it the Dino King. No one claimed to have seen it clearly and lived. Some said it was as tall as a building with jaws that could crush stone. Others swore it had a roar that could stop a man's heart. The stories varied, yet all shared the same warning. Do not cross its path. Jake did not come for legends alone. He was searching for evidence that could change the world. Living proof of creatures thought long dead could reshape science and history. His gear was simple but effective. A strong pack, a rifle for last resort, a camera, rope, tools for digging, and his father's old compass, which had guided him through deserts and frozen wastes. He trusted his instincts, but here every shadow seemed alive. On the evening of his 4th day, a strange sound drifted through the forest. It was not the bellow of the grazing giants, nor the chatter of smaller creatures. This was deeper and more deliberate. Each note rose and fell in a pattern almost like a call across distance. The trees around him seemed to listen. Even the river's rush felt quieter. He felt the hair on his neck rise. He remembered the words of an old guide from the nearest village. If you hear the king calling, do not answer, and do not stay still. Move until the sound fades. Yet Jake stayed rooted, scanning the treeline for movement. The sun dipped lower, staining the mist with blood-red light. The valley seemed to hold its breath. Something in that moment told him the true journey had only just begun. The next morning broke with a haze that blurred the horizon. Jake awoke early, his senses sharpened by the memory of the strange call from the night before. He packed his gear quickly and decided to push deeper into the valley. The plan was to follow the river downstream where the forest thinned and the land opened into wide grasslands. If the great herbivores lived there, perhaps the apex predator would not be far behind. For hours he trekked through mud and tangled roots. The calls of birds gave way to an eerie silence. Even the buzzing insects seemed to vanish. That silence carried its own weight pressing against his ears. He had learned long ago that in the wild, silence often meant a predator was near. His hand drifted toward the strap of his rifle, though he hoped he would not need it. Midday sun poured through the canopy in shafts of gold. He paused to drink from the river, bending low when a sudden tremor rippled through the water. Small ripples turned into concentric waves. He froze. Something large had stepped into the river upstream. A shadow slid across the far bank, tall and lean, but the mist kept its form hidden. The next step shook the earth under his boots. Jake backed away slowly, but his foot caught a root. He fell with a grunt, his pack thudding against the soil. The sound carried, and the shadow stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then the mist parted just enough for him to glimpse a massive shape. A head rose above the reeds. Teeth like ivory daggers caught the sunlight. Eyes the color of molten gold fixed on him. The creature's nostrils flared as it drew in his scent. It stepped forward, revealing a body armored in scars from countless battles. This was no young hunter. This was the king. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears, yet he could not look away. The beast tilted its head, as if measuring the distance between them. Then with a sound like rolling thunder, it let out a roar that made his bones vibrate. The trees quivered. Birds erupted from the canopy in a storm of wings. Jake scrambled backward into the undergrowth, his heart pounding. The king advanced but did not charge. It moved with the certainty of a predator that knew it controlled the ground. Jake pushed himself to his feet and retreated until he was hidden by thick ferns. The roar echoed again, this time from farther away. It had allowed him to leave. That thought chilled him more than the encounter itself. By dusk, Jake had reached a ridge overlooking the plains. He knelt scanning the herds of long necks grazing far below. A ripple of movement cut through them, as if a wave passed under the surface of the grass. Then chaos erupted. The herd bolted in every direction. Through the dust and panic, he saw the king again. It struck with terrifying speed, sinking its jaws into the flank of a straggler. The scream of the dying beast carried across the valley. Jake's stomach knotted. That was when he knew the old tales had not exaggerated. This was a predator unlike any other. And if he could document it, the world would have undeniable proof that the age of dinosaurs had not ended here. But the risk was clear. One wrong move, and he would become just another part of the king's legend. That night, he made his decision. He would not leave the valley until he had captured the Dino King on film up close. Not a shadow in the mist, but a full image of the living ruler of Kilora. The choice burned in his mind as the forest came alive again with distant roars and the cries of hunted prey. The hunt had begun. The following morning dawned pale and cold. Mist clung to the ground, and the trees stood like silent sentinels. Jake awoke with his mind set on one goal: track the king and record everything. He ate a meager breakfast, checked his camera and rifle, then began following the river downstream toward the plains. The echoes of last night's roar still haunted him. He had learned from years of field work that predators left trails without meaning to. Broken branches, disturbed soil, and the faint imprint of heavy claws told stories to those who could read them. Here, the ground showed deep three-toed impressions almost a foot long. They led toward a gap in the forest where the canopy broke open into a scar of sunlight. As he moved forward, he noticed a faint coppery scent in the air. Blood. He crouched low and found drag marks in soil, grooves made by something massive pulling prey. He followed them to a clearing where the remains of the straggler from yesterday's hunt lay in ruin. Vultures with black feathers picked at the carcass, hissing at him as he approached. The sheer scale of the bones made him stop. The bite marks in the femur were deep and jagged. No modern predator could have made them. He crouched with his camera, snapping photos from different angles. The carcass was only partially eaten, suggesting the king had eaten its fill and left the rest for scavengers. That detail told Jake something important. This predator hunted often enough that it could afford to leave a kill unfinished. The valley was rich in prey. As he examined the site, a sound reached him, a low, rhythmic thud, like giant drums in the distance. He froze. It grew louder, accompanied by the creak of swaying trees. Jake moved behind a fallen log and crouched. Through the haze, a colossal shadow emerged. The king returned. Its stride was deliberate and unhurried, its golden eyes scanning the clearing. Sunlight hit its scarred hide, revealing a crown of bony ridges above the eyes that gave it an almost regal silhouette. It stopped at the carcass, sniffed, then tore another massive chunk from the rib cage. Jake's breath came shallow. The lens of his camera trembled as he filmed. Each movement of the king was a study in lethal grace. Then the beast stopped feeding. Its head turned sharply toward his hiding place. Jake's stomach turned to ice. The king moved forward, slow but certain. Its eyes locked on him as if it had known. He was there all along. The distance between them shrank. Jake gripped his rifle but hesitated. Shooting now would only provoke it. He inched backward, using the log for cover. A sudden roar split the air, not from the king but from across the clearing. Another predator emerged from the trees, smaller yet still massive, with a leaner build and darker hide. Jake's pulse surged. The king swung its head toward the intruder and released a guttural growl that seemed to shake the ground. The smaller predator circled, perhaps trying to steal the carcass. The king lunged forward with terrifying speed. The clash was explosive, teeth snapping, tails whipping through the air. Jake's camera caught every movement, though he struggled to keep them in frame. The king slammed its opponent with a shoulder strike, sending it crashing into the undergrowth. The intruder fled limping into the forest. The king roared again, victorious. Then, to Jake's surprise, it ignored the carcass and moved away in the same direction as the fleeing rival. A chase, perhaps to finish what it started. Jake waited until the sounds faded before emerging from hiding. His hands were trembling. He had witnessed something no human had likely seen in millions of years: territorial combat between two apex dinosaurs. By late afternoon, he had followed the trail to the edge of the plains. Here, herds of massive plant-eaters grazed, long-necked giants that swayed as they moved. Smaller ceratopsians clustered together, their frills catching the sunlight. Raptors stalked the edges like wolves, waiting for weakness. Jake stayed hidden, glassing the horizon with binoculars. He spotted the king far off, pacing the edge of the herd. The predator's movements were slow, almost lazy, yet every step was calculated. It was waiting for an opportunity, an old or injured target. Hours passed. Then a young ceratopsian strayed, too far from its group. The king exploded into motion, its strides covering the distance in seconds. Dust rose like smoke as the herd scattered. Jake's camera whirred. Capturing the moment, the king lunged and brought the youngster down with crushing jaws. But this hunt was different. The king did not kill instantly. Instead, it stood over the struggling prey and scanned the plains as if expecting competition. Within minutes, a pack of raptors appeared, hissing and snapping. The king bellowed and lashed its tail, sending one tumbling. It drove them off but kept glancing toward the tree line. Jake followed its gaze and froze. From the shadows, massive shapes emerged. 3 more predators, similar to the king but smaller, stepped into the light. Jake's throat went dry. Were they rivals? Kin? The king lowered its head, not in aggression but in recognition. The newcomers approached the kill and began feeding alongside it. Jake realized the truth. This was no solitary tyrant. The king ruled as part of a coalition, perhaps a family group, that made it far more dangerous than he imagined. Coordinated hunters could dominate the valley entirely. As night fell, Jake retreated to his camp, his mind racing. If the king's coalition grew, the balance of the ecosystem could shift. Entire herds might vanish, and with them, the survival of the valley's delicate chain of life. The next day brought fresh danger. While following the king's tracks, Jake stumbled upon a nesting site. Enormous eggs lay half buried in the sand, their shells patterned like ancient stone. He knelt to photograph them when a shadow fell across him. Slowly he turned. One of the smaller coalition members stood at the edge of the clearing, eyes locked on him. Jake's instinct screamed to run, but he knew movement would trigger a chase. He slowly stood, backing away step by step. The dinosaur matched his pace, head low, teeth bared. Then a roar split the air, the king's roar. The smaller hunter froze, glancing toward the sound. From the tree-line, the king emerged. Its gaze flicked between Jake and the smaller predator. For a tense moment, Jake thought it might attack both. Instead, the king stepped between them, nudged the smaller one back toward the nest, then turned and fixed its molten eyes on Jake. There was no charge, no chase, just a look, deep, assessing. Then the king turned and walked away. Jake stood frozen long after it vanished. He understood now. The king was aware of him, fully aware, and was allowing him to live, not out of mercy, but because it did not yet see him as a threat. And that was the most dangerous position of all. The storm rolled in without warning. Winds howled across the plains, bending tall grass into silver waves. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the jagged silhouettes of the valley. Jake crouched in the shelter of a boulder, his camera wrapped in waterproof cloth. He had been shadowing the king for 2 days, waiting for something to break the rhythm of the hunts. That break came in the form of chaos. Far to the west, a herd of long-necked sauropods stampeded toward the river. The ground shook under their combined weight. Jake's binoculars revealed the cause, a massive predator unlike the king. This one was larger, heavier, with scars crisscrossing its muzzle and a torn frill of scales along its neck. Its movements were slower, but each step radiated brutal strength. The king appeared from the north, charging toward the intruder. The storm's roar was drowned by the deep, primal bellows of the two giants. They met on the open plain, circling each other, tails lashing. Jake sprinted along the ridge to keep them in view, his boots slipping in the mud. Rain slicked the king's hide, turning it to a gleaming shield of muscle. The rival lowered its head, jaws parting to show broken yet deadly teeth. Lightning flashed again, and they lunged at the same moment. The impact was thunder within thunder. The king struck first, clamping down on the rival's neck. The rival bellowed and twisted, slamming the king sideways into the mud. For a heartbeat, Jake thought the king would be crushed. But it rolled, using its tail to sweep the rival's legs. The older predator staggered, and the king lunged again, driving it back. The coalition appeared, the 3 smaller hunters from before. They circled the fight, snapping and roaring, trying to distract the intruder. The rival lashed out, catching one in the flank and sending it sprawling with a cry. The king roared in fury and renewed its assault. Jake filmed with shaking hands, knowing this was history unfolding in the storm. The fight shifted toward the sauropod herd. The giants trumpeted in panic, their long necks swinging as they fled. The rivals seized a moment, breaking away from the king and lunging at a young sauropod. That was a mistake. The king slammed into the rival's side with bone-cracking force. Both predators crashed to the ground, rolling in the mud. The king's jaws locked on the rival's throat. The rival thrashed, claws raking, tail whipping, but the king held on. Rain turned red in the churned earth. The smaller coalition members darted in, biting at the rival's legs and flanks, weakening it, slowing it. The rival's struggles grew erratic. Jake realized this was not just a fight for food. It was a war for the crown. The final moment came with terrifying speed. The king twisted violently, and there was a sickening snap. The rival went limp. For a long moment, the king stood over its fallen foe, chest heaving, rain streaming from its frill of scars. Then it threw back its head and roared, a sound so vast and deep that it seemed to roll through the bones of the earth. The coalition joined in, their smaller voices layering into a chorus that cut through the storm. Jake lowered his camera. He was soaked, exhausted, and trembling. He knew he had just witnessed a moment the king's rule was solidified beyond challenge. The valley belonged to it, and nothing alive could dispute that now. But even as the rival's body lay still, Jake's gaze drifted to the horizon. More shadows moved in the rain, shapes he could not yet identify. The king's reign was secure for now, but the world beyond the valley was stirring. Lightning struck again, and the king's eyes found him across the distance. For a heartbeat, they locked. There was no malice, only recognition. The king knew he was there, and it was letting him go, for now. Jake backed away through the wet grass, the roar still echoing in his skull. The storm swallowed the plain, hiding predator and prey alike. The king had triumphed, yet the balance of this ancient place felt as fragile as ever. The storm eased by morning, leaving the valley heavy with the scent of wet earth and blood. Jake descended from the ridge, slowly, every step sinking into mud that tried to pull his boots free. The air was quiet except for the distant call of water birds returning to the river. The plain where the battle had raged was now a wasteland of churned soil and broken grass. The body of the rival lay where it had fallen its bulk, already drawing scavengers. A pair of huge carrion birds tore at the flanks, their wings glossy black in the weak sunlight. Smaller creatures darted in to snatch scraps before darting away again. The king was nowhere in sight. Jake followed the trail of deep footprints toward the river, where fresh water ran fast from the night's downpour. He found them there. The king stood chest-deep in the current, drinking and washing blood from his hide. The coalition lingered nearby, wary and alert, as if sensing that the valley was not entirely safe even after victory. Jake crouched behind a fallen tree, his camera steady in his hands. The lens caught every scar, every twitch of muscle, as the king lifted its head and scanned the horizon. The sun broke through the clouds for a moment, painting the great predator in gold. In that light, it looked less like a monster and more like a living relic of a lost world. He knew his footage was priceless. Proof beyond doubt that the age of dinosaurs had not ended here. Yet a thought gnawed at him. This valley could not remain hidden forever. If outsiders came, they would bring weapons, traps, greed. The king's rule would not end in battle, but in chains. A movement in the grass drew his attention. Across the river, a shape moved low and fast. Not another predator, but a human figure. Dark clothing, mud-streaked face, a rifle slung across the shoulder. Jake's stomach tightened. He was not the only one who had found the valley. The figure stopped at the riverbank, watching the king with an intensity that chilled him. Then they raised a small device to their mouth and spoke into it. A radio. Jake could not hear the words, but he understood the meaning. Reinforcements were coming. He slipped back into the trees, moving as quietly as possible. Every instinct screamed to leave now while he still could, but another part of him refused. If others were coming to capture or kill the king, he had to warn it somehow. The thought was absurd, a man warning a dinosaur, but the urge felt like truth. By midday, he reached his camp. He packed only essentials, camera tapes, a few days of food. The rest he left behind. He followed the river downstream, keeping to the trees, until he reached a narrow ford. The king's tracks were fresh here. Crossing quickly, he pushed deeper into the southern forest, where the canopy closed tight overhead. Near dusk, he found them again. The king resting in a hollow of soft earth. Coalition members sprawled nearby. The air was thick with the scent of wet leaves and the low rumble of the king's breathing. Jake stayed at the edge of the clearing, heart pounding. He whispered into the stillness, as if the king could understand. "They are coming!" His voice was low, almost a breath. The king's head lifted, eyes locking on him once more. No sound came from its throat, but its gaze held him until he stepped back into the shadows. As night fell, Jake heard the distant whine of engines somewhere beyond the ridges. The outside world was closing in. Night swallowed the valley, and the air grew heavy with the sound of rain dripping from leaves. Jake moved along the ridgeline in darkness, his senses sharpened by fear and urgency. He could see faint lights far to the north where the engines had been. Whoever they were, they had entered the valley. He reached a narrow bluff that overlooked the lower plain. Through gaps in the trees, he saw shapes moving, not predators but men, for them at least, all armed and carrying packs. They moved with purpose, stepping in the prints left by the king, as if following a map only they could read. Jake's mind raced. He had no weapon, no authority to stop them. All he had was a knowledge of the valley's paths and the king's habits. That would have to be enough. He doubled back along a side trail, heading toward the southern forest where the king had been resting. Every step was a gamble. If he was wrong, the king would be gone, and the hunters would close in. The forest was black and silent when he reached the hollow. The coalition was there, but tensed, their bodies, low tails flicking in warning. The king stood among them, head high, nostrils flaring. Jake stepped into the clearing, his voice low and urgent. "They are tracking you. You have to move." The words were meaningless to the king, yet something passed between them. The great predator's gaze was fixed and steady, as if weighing this small, strange creature that had appeared in its world again and again. Then, without a sound, it turned and began to move. The coalition followed, slipping into the deeper shadows of the forest. Jake trailed them at a distance, using the undergrowth for cover. They moved fast despite their size, silent, except for the heavy breath of effort. The hunters were somewhere behind and closing. More than once he heard the faint crack of branches and the murmur of human voices. The king led them to higher ground where basalt cliffs rose like black teeth from the earth. Here the forest thinned, and wind carried the scent of rain and stone. The king paused at the cliff edge, scanning the valley below. Jake saw lights moving far beneath. The hunters had reached the open plain. Suddenly the king gave a low, deep call that vibrated through the ground. It was not a roar or challenge, but a sound of command. The coalition scattered, vanishing into gullies and ravines. The king stepped back from the cliff, turning toward the darkest part of the forest. Jake realized this was no retreat in panic. It was strategy. The hunters would find nothing but empty tracks. Hours later, Jake stood alone on the ridge, watching the first pale light of dawn seep into the sky. The valley was quiet again. No engines, no human voices. Somewhere out there, the king was moving deeper into lands Jake had never seen. Land that might remain untouched for years, or maybe only days. He looked down at the camera slung at his side. Inside were images that could change the world. Proof of survival, proof of a predator that ruled its kingdom with unmatched strength. Yet his hands felt heavy as he thought about what that proof might bring. Jake turned away from the valley path. The tape would stay with him hidden until he knew it could do more good than harm. The king's world was not ready for his world, and his world was not ready for the truth. As the sun broke over the horizon, he glanced back one last time. Far away on a ridge, just visible in the light, a dark shape stood watching. The king's silhouette framed against the rising sun was still and proud. For a heartbeat, they regarded each other across the distance. Then the king turned and was gone. Jake smiled despite the weight in his chest. Some rulers needed no crown, no throne, no witness. The valley would remember its king long after the rest of the world had forgotten his name.